I'd be lying next to him in bed and I'd be like, oh, you've been looking at Instagram for a long time now. Why don't you pick up a book? I know what might be good. Why don't you read my book?
Hello and welcome to the Waterstones podcast. I'm Will Rycroft, and in this episode we're going to be taking a good long look at modern life and asking ourselves what on earth is going on and why do I feel like I'm getting it all wrong. Pandora Sykes has long had her finger on the pulse through her journalism and podcasting on the high-low with Dolly Alderton. How Do We Know We're Doing It Right is her collection of essays on modern millennial life, with lessons for all of us and a new resonance brought on by current events. We had a great chat about making sense of it all. Pandora, thank you so much for joining us on the Waterstones podcast from home. It's much appreciated.
Thank you so much for having me.
Your collection of essays, How Do We Know We're Doing It Right? It covers a wide array of topics, and we're not going to get a chance to talk about them all today. I would love to, because there's so much in there. But actually, before we even begin to talk about what's in the book itself, topic-wise, I wanted to talk to you about books, because one thing from reading these essays that I really picked up on is your clear love of books. You are always quoting from other people's work. You are mentioning other authors. You do talk specifically about how books are absolutely part of who you are. Could we talk a little bit about that first? Because it's so clear to me that you get so much of your, I suppose, your information and your ideas from what you read. Is that right?
Absolutely. It's my number one hobby, and I think of myself as a reader before I am a writer, because I don't know what I'd be like unless I read a lot, because it's such a key way for me to understand the world. And the work of other people was really important to this book, in the same way that books are really important to the high-low. I really enjoy kind of championing other people's work, especially work that has taught me lots. And these essays aren't personal essays. They have a personal element, but they're also about lots of different views and experiences. And so other people's writing becomes really mandatory, as part of my work, as much as it is a part of my pleasure.
Finding the time to read can sometimes be quite tricky. And I think one of the slight myths about lockdown is that we would all have so much time to just sort of sit around and read books. And I haven't found that to be the case at all. In fact, I've probably read less since we've been locked down, because, of course, there's so much more to do at home. I have a family, so I have all that sort of stuff to deal with. And I suppose there are always so many things clamoring for our attention. How do you make time to read? I think you sort of mentioned in the book that you would rather read than watch TV quite a lot of the time. And that's how you spend your evenings, for example.
Yes, exactly. That is how I choose to read in the evenings over, lots of people relax over cooking for a long time, or they might do an exercise class, or they'll watch a box set. And those things are all quite rare for me to do in the evening. And I try and put my telephone to bed unless I'm working. I have actually worked a lot of evenings recently, so that hasn't really happened. But I've had quite bad insomnia in the last 3 years, so I've moved away from technology at nighttime for that reason as well. And often it can take me 2 or 3 hours to get to sleep. So it's not unheard of for me to read a whole book in a night when I'm trying to sleep. So I find it very easy to find lots of time to read, but not lots of time to read. I am able to find time to read because I'm not doing, aside from working and mothering, there's not anything else that I'm doing for pleasure right now. That's something that I always prioritize. But I do think people feel really guilty about not having time to read. There's kind of a morality ascribed to reading, which I find quite riveting, actually.
Well, it is weird, isn't it? Because this sort of supposed moral superiority that you have if what you're doing is spending your time reading books, whereas, of course, you can get the same nourishment from other places. I mean, I'm saying this as the representative of Waterstones booksellers. Of course, books are important, and to me personally, hugely important. And in fact, as you say, having that time when I have had a chance to sit and read a book from cover to cover, that is one of the most rewarding experiences I think I ever had in my life. When you get the chance to do that, I don't know why it is about that thing of reading it from cover to cover in one go somehow makes the reading experience more special, somehow more, I don't know, interactive. You're more engaged with it, but it's just so rare for me to have the time to do that.
I mean, it's something that I love doing and I feel kind of most content when I'm reading. But not everyone does feel like that. You know, some people really don't get that from sitting down and reading for a really long time. Like my husband, you know, he'll probably read 1 or 2 books a year. It took him, I think, 5 months to read my book. And I'd be lying next to him in bed and I'd be like, oh, you've been looking at Instagram for a long time now. Why don't you pick up a book? I know what might be good. Why don't you read my book? So, you know, it's absolutely not how everyone likes to relax. And I think particularly during the pandemic, I've noticed that quite a few people have had the time to read, but not the focus, that we have been very frazzled and distracted, and people have felt quite jittery. And reading can be quite hard when you can't really settle.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, yeah, not being able to settle is definitely one of the weird things about this lockdown. And I suppose what's interesting about your essay collection is, of course, you wrote it and sort of filed it just before lockdown happened, didn't you? And so many things have happened and so many things have changed about the way that we live our lives. I wondered whether there was sort of an essay or a chapter that you wish you could now include into the book because of what we've all learnt in the last 3 or 4 months or so.
I did actually want to add in a new prologue, but I was told it would be impossible. And I actually think that now it was probably a good idea, because writing a prologue in the middle of what's happening, I would rather write on about things from a period of reflection.
Mm.
And actually, I wrote that book during my pregnancy, which was a really intense time to be writing a book. And quite a condensed time period that I wrote it in. But when I'm pregnant, I always feel like I'm in this slightly liminal space, like I'm outside of what I'm observing. And so being able to write from the outside in was really helpful. I think whilst at first I felt really worried that I had finished it before the pandemic, I now feel relieved, because I don't know how it would read to have written it from the eye of the storm. What
Mm.
I hope is, I agree, we've led such different lives to the lives I write about in the book, but we will start to go back to a semblance of our old lives, quote unquote. And I hope that the book may maybe help us see how some of the ways in which we live those lives, and think carefully about how our lives may serve us better in the future.
Absolutely. We're going to. I'll come on to some of those things specifically a bit later. Obviously, as a Generation X male reading a book of essays about millennial women, I want to start off with the area of great strength for me, which is fashion. As a man who buys all his clothes in the Gap sale, I want to talk about fashion because I found that chapter really, really fascinating. You start off talking about the dress. And of course, anybody who's been awake for the last year will know exactly which dress we're talking about. And what I found really, really interesting was this idea of why it was that £40 Zara dress became a sort of almost not a uniform, but why women wanted to all be wearing the same dress, when fashion, of course, is usually about making a statement where you're not wearing the same kind of clothes. And in fact, it used to be a social faux pas to turn up somewhere wearing the same dress as somebody else, whereas this dress was something else. Please explain to me what was going on there and why it was such a unique moment.
I last saw that dress half an hour ago. I went to buy a burrito from the cafe at the end of my road before I spoke to you, and I saw a friend and she was wearing the dress. That dress was, I have never seen a piece of high street fashion do what that dress did. I mean, I talk about in that essay, which was a kind of way to talk about the memology of women, and the way that increasingly, as our choice increases, the kind of parameters of how we're dressing or how we're presenting ourselves as women seem to be narrowing. And that dress fascinated me because there was an Instagram account set up to track it around the UK. It didn't do what it did here anywhere else, weirdly. It was just the UK.
Yeah.
North America didn't have it. And you know, in one picture there are 8 women wearing this dress, while standing with John Burko, which is slightly odd. Like, and I remember going into Oaxaca, that, you know, Mexican food
Mm.
restaurant, and seeing 4 women within the same small restaurant wearing this dress, and I was like, this is crazy. What is going on? It feels really dystopian.
Mm.
And it did feel a bit like a uniform. And it was a perfectly nice dress, but I didn't say on it, you know, everyone will be wearing this for the end of time. But no other dress has managed to make it do that. But I think what what I was finding interesting and what I tried to probe deeper with these essays is that just because we talk about something in cultural dialogue or it becomes kind of rhetoric doesn't mean we're seeing it penetrate at a deeper level. So we talk a lot about the kind of emancipation of women and, you know, we live in the age of individualism and everyone's just doing whatever they want and everyone's so original and social media allows you to express yourself any way you want. And whilst I think we're talking about that and seeing that on a surface level, the deeper reverberations of that, I think, is that actually people have become more tribal and more similar than they were. And quite often that is coming from a negative place. It's coming from a place of fear that there are now so many ways to get it wrong that there's this idea that to get it right is quite a limited set of options to choose from. Whereas a lot of women you see didn't mind. Like Shirin Kale wrote a piece for The Guardian, which I quoted in that essay, where this woman says, you know I'm not meant to like it because everyone's got it, but that just makes me want it more. There was, like, in general, there was a real resistance to the fact that everyone had it. Like, that's not going to put me off. It was very strange, but I think it said quite a lot about where we are with certain things at the moment.
And my jaw actually dropped when I read, you said that the Zara website, for example, is on average, people who buy from Zara are buying clothes from them 17 times a year.
Yes. Yeah.
But that seems extraordinary to me. Let's talk a little bit about what's going on there with the sort of online clothes buying, the sort of, not so much the fast fashion, because you do talk a bit about that, but sort of Zara in particular.
Zara, I think, is has almost become a kind of cultural symbol for not just millennial women, but a lot of millennial women. You know, almost all of my friends dress in Zara. They dominate the high street. And there are other stores that come closer, but nothing really is like the giant that is Zara. And the fact that the average customer not just visits the store 17 times a year, shops the store 17 times a year. And I think that kind of shopping has become unconscious, that it is now entirely normal to shop so frequently from Zara. And what I was interested by is that a lot of those people who shop from Zara are people who consider themselves quite discerning and are probably very engaged in the climate and in the kind of issues around Rana Plaza and factories and things like that. But the truth is that, that kind of shopping is not hugely different to shopping from faster than fast fashion like boohoo.com. And nor is it that different to someone who has lots of money and shops constantly from designer labels. All of this kind of shopping that we have seen a rampant increase in subscribes to the notion that shopping is a hobby and that it should be done regularly and that it should be refreshed. The issue with Zara is just that it just is more effective at getting women to do that than anywhere else.
As somebody who's, as I said, who sees the boxes arrive regularly, it certainly is highly effective. I'm not sure what they're putting in the water there, but it definitely works. We'll move away from fashion now, and I suppose it's linked in a way. You write a brilliant essay which is about authenticity, and moving away from how it is that you dress yourself and sort of display yourself. I suppose particularly authenticity when it's tied together with things like social media and how we present ourselves. Social media is not a new thing. It's been around for decades now. How are we still getting it so wrong when it comes to our authentic selves and how we present ourselves online?
I think the reason why there's such a conundrum there is because people are trying this. They're attempting something impossible. They're trying to unite their online and their offline selves as one fully rounded person. But the internet does not lend itself to a fully rounded person because a real flesh and blood person is inconsistent. They make mistakes. They're not always operating in the same set of moods or even with the same set of interests. People change every single day. Yourself or yourselves, because I do believe that we're made up of multiple selves, are in a state of flux. And so this idea that we can kind of have this like solid online identity is really dangerous. And I think it becomes particularly interesting in the context of cancel culture as well, which is a theory chucked around with wild abandon. I don't always believe it's true. Cancel culture is sometimes invoked by someone who just wants to say something controversial and get away with it and then doesn't like it when there's a Twitter pylon. But it also raises quite interesting ideas about how we expect people to be, and this kind of runs throughout the essays. It's in wellness and it's in fashion and it's in the raw nerve, about sensitivity, is we expect someone to be kind of polished and seamless, and for life as well, to be friction free. And the internet might be able to deliver that to an extent, but it can't deliver that at all times. And I think it's leaking offline, so that we now expect that of people all the time. And that's just not what human beings are like.
Yeah, absolutely. I loved you said something about the fact that everybody is expected to have a sort of complete and fully formed opinion about anything and everything if they're ever asked about it. And we're so scared of actually saying, do you know what? I don't know what I think about that. But maybe you could tell me what you think about it. You know, that you could actually sort of admit that you don't know. Whereas, of course, Twitter is filled with people professing that they know absolutely everything about whatever it is that's being talked about, and you need to prove otherwise. It's a strange, as I say, it's a strange position we put ourselves in, isn't it? Where we can't admit any kind of fallibility or ignorance.
I think everything's just become incredibly binary. And that's a real regression. And it's something I really worry about, is everything is becoming more tribal. And to kind of give an opinion that is seen as dissenting to the rest of your views has become incredibly dangerous. And the thing is the internet does not lend itself to someone saying, I don't know. That's not a sexy answer. It's not interested in that. And so as a result, we're seeing people pushing themselves to have an opinion. Often it's something they haven't read enough about, and so what they do is they steal someone else's opinion, they meme
Mm.
someone else's opinion, so that we're constantly sort of trading off what someone else has said. And I feel pushed to do that quite often. You know, people will get cross sometimes if I talk about something on the high low and I'm not sure what I think. They want me to come down on a side, and I've experienced that across other work as well. And I truly believe that one of the most powerful things we can do is say, I don't know. I'm not sure yet. I'm just not sure why that's seen as a weakness. Actually, it's a strength.
Mm. I couldn't agree more. You mentioned sort of there about how things can leak from the online world to our, sort of the real world. I loved your chapter about work, and your description of the leaky identity. So, of course, I work in social media, and for a while when I first started, there was a real leak between what was work and what was me, because, of course, I was trying to demonstrate my ability to do social media as a job by sharing my life. And now I've sort of do it as a job. I barely use my personal social accounts now because I'm so exhausted from the work stuff, but also because I'm trying to put a divide between those two things. It's so hard to do, though, isn't it? You talk about how you and your husband can find yourselves very easily having work leak into your sort of personal life at home, where you should be closing the computer and doing something together, but it's very, very hard to have that divide, isn't it?
Yeah, the irony of me when I was writing that book is that I was about as unboundaried as could possibly be. You know, I was working evenings and I was working weekends, and that's not a way I like to work, but you know, needs must. And I think what's been really interesting about this lockdown is actually, I think initially I thought that everyone's identities were going to get so much leakier because they were all working from home. And I
Mm,
wondered how easy it would be to clock off when you're not physically removing yourself from your workplace, which is what Derek Thompson, the Atlantic writer who came up with the theory of the leaky identity, was talking about. He said, you know, you no longer leave work at work. Work is always with you because we always have a smartphone on us.
mm,
And so I know we heard a bit of people during lockdown saying, like, I can't get out of saying I'm late for a meeting because I only had to open my laptop. But I also saw a really renewed focus from people being like, this is when I'm available for work and this is when I'm not available for work. And I have quite a leaky identity with work and home life anyway, because I work from my home, which is the place where I'm also a mother and a place where I'm also just, you know, in repose occasionally.
mm.
So that naturally is quite a blended situation. But as a result, I am quite uh, specific about where I work. You know, I work in my study at a desk on a desktop computer, and when the door's shut, I'm working, and when the door's open, I'm not. And that sounds pretty basic, but I think those boundaries are really fundamental. Uh, if only for us to, and that's why I'm quite strict with my telephone, because some people love feeling, like their head is a swarm of bees all the time. But I felt like this relentless chatter in my head was not bringing out the best in me. And so trying to think about how we could separate our work selves and our personal selves, or indeed trying to look at what we call work full stop. I think the way we talk about the work of the home or unpaid care work is like it's not work, because it's got no GDP, so we're not interested because it's not talked about in economic terms. And that, I think, is a fallacy. And I also think it's a gendered fallacy, because the majority of that care work, whether or not it involves children, is still done by women.
Oh, absolutely. I think one of the big shocks for, I don't want to pile in on men here, but I think a lot of this, it was men who were very confused at the beginning of lockdown, because they were sort of assuming that their wives or partners or whoever it was who's been doing childcare would continue to do that, because of course they had to do their work during the day. And of course, it might be possible that both partners had to do work during the day, and that they were suddenly getting this taste of what it means to actually juggle work and life at the same time. Men have really discovered what it means to actually look after their own children at home, and juggle that with work, and a bit of a shock for quite a lot of them. I mean, I think it is fair to say that, isn't it? That sort of that work at home has become gendered. A lot of people feel like they have a sort of 50-50 balance, but I'm sure it's not quite as equal as even the most woke men would like to think.
I think what I was interested in is that you can have a 50-50 physical balance, which is what me and my husband have. My husband is brilliant, and he actually has done more of the childcare when I was in the sort of dire straits of book writing. And but I was still feeling overloaded, and I think I wanted to delve into maybe the sort of shadowy stuff that we hadn't yet talked about. And that's when I became really interested in the work of a Canadian psychologist called Darby Saxby, who talks about the allostatic load, which is the wear and tear that stress can cause the body. And she found that women tend to have that more. And often this comes from the cognitive load, which is sort of like the executive functioning of a household. So you might have a 50-50 split with the physical chores, but the cognitive load is stuff like who's buying the kids their new shoes when they grow out of them, or who is doing the food shop, or who is arranging to get the armchair cleaned when the cat throws up all over it, or who is doing the Christmas shopping, who's stuffing the stockings, who's arranging how they get to the grandparents next Sunday. And I am not saying this happens for everyone, but anecdotally, from who I spoke to, there does tend to be one partner that takes that on. And in a heterosexual relationship, it tends to be the woman. What I was also interested in is that there was absolutely zero research on how this breaks down in same-sex partnerships. And I interviewed 3 or 4 different couples, and even within those couples, there was always one person that carried the cognitive load. So I think the conclusion is it is almost impossible for there to be a 50-50 split of all the care work in all of its forms. And perhaps that's not a problem. Perhaps we just need to be more aware of what that care work actually involves.
I think certainly, as long as whoever's not doing it understands that the other person is doing it, and that that it has a stress implication,
Totally.
then that sort of is okay. If you're a man listening and you're apoplectic with rage at this, if you can tell me what size your kids' shoes are, then you're off the hook. But
That's the
otherwise,
test. That's the test
that is the
I
test.
do.
Yeah. I want to come now to sort of culture, because you write about how we have this sort of proliferation of culture, which is now streamed into our homes, or can follow us around if we are on the move. And of course, anyone listening to this is listening to a podcast, which can be another form of mobile entertainment. But there's this idea of the collective experience that used to exist with TV watching. You speak brilliantly about watching in a sort of dormitory. Was it in the dormitory at your boarding school or in the common room?
Yeah.
Sort of watching, yeah. Whereas that doesn't really exist so much anymore because, of course, everybody watches stuff on demand when they want. They might talk about it together at some point on social media. What is good about that, and what is not so good about that?
I mean, it has become, I think, very singular, hasn't it? My husband's been binging Entourage completely on his own. I haven't watched any of it with him.
Yeah,
And I mean, obviously, in a way, it's great that there's so much great entertainment at the tips of our fingers. But I I fail to appreciate, I think, how much of it there is because it just doesn't feel necessary to me. And I think that's something I found really interesting about this idea of the paradox of choice. As the psychologist Barry Schwartz says, to have no choice is unbearable. Of course, people need fundamental freedoms in order to lead happy lives. But to have too much choice can also be addling, because where do you start? And,
yeah,
and and that's, and when people say to me, or when you asked me earlier, like about reading a lot, yeah, I read a lot. I might know what's going on in publishing. I don't have the first clue about the scope of podcasting or movies or music or Netflix. I do watch a bit. I'll watch the things that kind of everyone's talking about, or the most brilliant things. But I haven't touched the sides of so much of it.
yeah. But there's that weird thing as well. I think even with some of the most successful programs, I suppose what's happening now, people are talking about "I May Destroy You" potentially. I suppose Normal People was something that was slightly collective because actually those episodes, whilst they were available to binge if you wanted to, were released on TV on a sort of vaguely weekly schedule, and so there was an element of needing to tune in at a certain time to watch it, and therefore to be watching at the same pace as everybody else. Whereas, of course, now with other programs, you can watch them at whatever pace, which might mean for you binging an entire series in a day. I'm holding my hands up there. I definitely have done that. But it means that you don't have that sort of ability, the water cooler conversation that used to exist for normal programming. And that does change things slightly in terms of how we are engaging and sharing culture. One of the things about too many things, the things that I have to make decisions about, which I really don't want to have to make decisions about. So, for example, I'm old enough that when I was a kid, I seem to remember that basically, if you posted something, it went by Royal Mail. If you got on the train, it was the British Rail. If your gas came from British Gas, and that's just kind of how the world worked. It was just sort of one thing. Whereas now, I just got an email. I've got to change my utilities. Again, I feel like I'm doing this all the time. I've got to find another company because I've got to do a switch. I've got to go onto one of those comparison websites, and there is so much choice about some of the most boring things in life, which I don't want to have to make a choice about actually. And it's supposed to be a good thing. It's supposed to be meaning that I get cheaper gas or electricity or whatever. But part of me is just like, I'll just pay the rate if it just means you don't ever have to have this conversation with me ever again. And you mentioned that sort of, I call it the tyranny of choice.
Mm,
It's just, it
mm.
dominates so much of your time if you're having to make decisions about stuff all the time.
I think that as well kind of is related to this idea that we do more life admin than we've ever done before. You hear a lot of people being
Yes.
like, how have I got so much admin these days? And it is because nothing is straightforward anymore. And I think we're at this quite interesting point, which truly I don't know the answer to, but that progress has always depended on things being better and faster and quicker and cheaper and lots of choice. And now we have all of those things. We have endless places to shop at. It can be there, the very next day. We can get takeaways delivered to our home. We can book a holiday in an instant, Airbnb. It's an on demand culture. And we've got choice coming out of our eyeballs. And now what do we do? Well, what we need to do is we need to reverse, which is going to feel incredibly counterproductive to people. I think this is the first time in progress that I've been able to consider where progress is actually turning around and going other way. It's making
Mm,
things more expensive, and it's so that people can be paid fair prices, and it's reducing the amount of choice, and it's slowing things down for the sake of the climate. Sustainability is
mm.
not just about the planet, it's about the human cost as well, and kind of the moral cost. So I don't know how, I mean, I'm up for that, but I'm sure that in practice it's a lot more complicated, and that's quite a scary thought to a lot of people.
Yeah, absolutely. I think It felt like we were on the threshold of something very big with climate change, and then bizarrely, I think coronavirus has come along, and it's almost like a lot of people have forgotten about that as a thing. Somebody's mentioned the other day that they went to a pub, now that they were open again, and of course everything was plastic glasses,
Mm.
disposable. Had to get rid of everything because of coronavirus, and it was just a bit like, oh, we've all forgotten about plastic, have we? It's all absolutely fine now to be just chucking plastic all over the place. There is going to be, one thinks, a bit of a change in the way that people conduct their lives once we go back to some kind of normality. Or is it actually possible that we just slip back to exactly where we were? And what I mean, I suppose, is we've spoken a bit about how our working lives have changed, and a lot of people have gone, oh, do you know what, I really hate commuting, and it is possible to me for me to work from home, and it's improved things with my work-life balance and actually seeing my family, and maybe I could do a bit more of that once things have got a bit easier, and companies have realized that people can achieve the right amount of work even though they're not actually in the office. Do you have any thoughts about whether we might see a change in how we live our lives, or are we likely just to kind of snap back to normality?
I think it would be such a disservice to the people who have been on the front line during this pandemic and the people who have lost their lives if we went back to exactly the way things were before. I don't subscribe to the, slightly more woo-woo spiritual theories that we were sent coronavirus because we had got, we had just treated the planet like rubbish, and things the universe had had enough. I don't believe
Yeah.
that, although I actually know a lot of people who do subscribe to a notion of that. But
Mm.
I do think that if we weren't to take anything from this, I'm wary of silver linings because this has been the worst year ever for so many people. But if we were to take anything forward from this, it has got to be a young actor called Finn Wolfhard, who's in Stranger Things, described this the other day as the great pause. And I love
Hmm.
that. Like, let's see this time as like an extremely stressful, anxiety making time. But what can we take forward from it? And I do think I've been hearing a lot of people saying or writing about how they'd like to slow down on their social life, or they've realized that, they don't need to go on holiday so much, and why were they doing so much shopping, and did they really need to eat out all the time? Like, just scaling stuff back and being a bit more
Mm.
appreciative. Now, of course, that's easy to say when we had so little in the way of sort of treats or experiences to be titillated by. But I think that for a lot of people, they have decided that life is too short to maybe work how they were working.
Mm.
Or, as you say, that they don't want to be at a desk every week. Like, this has proved that people can work from home,
Yeah.
and that we don't need to have, and that companies don't need to be spending. However, like, do hot desk, hire smaller companies, and pay your workers more. I mean, that starts getting quite idealistic, but I think we almost have to be idealistic about this if we want to implement real change from what's happened and is happening. Then
Mm.
I mean, the government's not an idealistic one, so I don't know how that will work. But I think there are changes that one can make within their own life, and certainly, I feel like I'm compelled to make those.
And I suppose after this pause, in terms of doing it right, is there a simple way of sort of thinking about how to conduct your life after something like this? You've often spoken about the fact that people should do what they want, wear what they want, eat what makes them happy, conduct themselves. Is not about trying to prescribe yourself, or follow a certain set of rules. Is that a too simplistic reduction of what you mean by doing it right?
No, I don't think it's simplistic at all, because I think it sounds simple on paper, but the truth is that this could be a subconscious thing, and it's also insidious. So you may think that you're making choices on your own terms, but very often choice is so loaded that we make the choice that someone else has made, or we make those under pressurized conditions and too scared of an alternative. The
Mm.
positive I think about lockdown is that people have been living such different lives. Even amongst my friends, we've had such radically different experiences, day to day living experiences of lockdown. So I hope that that might give people more confidence to choose. From a place of conviction rather than a place of insecurity, those lives that they would want to live, and also maybe be a little bit more impervious in the face of these things which present as on your side, whether that's wellness or a new dress that can be on your doorstep for $2.99 tomorrow, you know, what's the hidden cost of that? Not just for the planet or for the people that made it, but for you. You know, how is that maybe compromising the life that you want to lead?
A fantastic note to end on, Pandora. As I said at the beginning, I could talk to you about every single essay in this book, but we make it probably the longest podcast we've ever made. And I don't want to give everything away. It's been really, really fantastic to speak to you about the things that we've covered. As I said, there's so much more in the book. Thank you for your time, and best of luck with the book and telling everybody about it. Have you got many more remotely recorded podcasts and things like that to do over the next few weeks?
Yes, I'm all about the remote podcast. It's just me. It's just me and my little speaker, and currently a half-eaten burrito. That's me for the next few weeks.
You are living the dream.
I am. Thank you, Will.
Lots to digest there, and our quest to better understand the world we live in continues next week when I welcome another podcast native, Emma Gannon, to talk about her debut novel, Olive. See you then.